Hello and welcome to the final episode of season 3 of British History, Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. Can you believe it's already season 3? I cannot. And we're coming to the end, but don't worry, because Lindsay and I have lots of fun things planned between now and September when we kick off season 4. We have some really great summer specials waiting for you. But even before we get to that, I want to just lean all the way in to this episode of season 3. And I want to start by thanking each and every one of you for your support with me on this journey. It's just been amazing. Can't believe it's already been 3 years and so many episodes. Thank you for listening, for watching on YouTube, for sharing with friends. I want to send a big shout out and welcome to so many new listeners who joined us recently. And as always, I want to send the biggest thank you, heartfelt, to the patrons of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics who very literally make all of this possible. Thank you so much. Now, June of 2023 for me this year is about more than the end of season 3. It's also when my first history book is coming out, The Tudors by Numbers. I want to thank all of you who have pre-ordered the book. You know, that makes such a difference to authors. We appreciate it so much when you take the time to pre-order. If you haven't, may I please ask that you consider doing so? It's available from Amazon and Amazon UK. It's available from my wonderful publisher, Pen and Sword. Please pre-order. And also know that there are some really fun activities over the summer. We're going to have some signed copies winging their ways out. But please, if you would pre-order, I would so appreciate it. Now, to get us all excited for The Tudors by Numbers, I wanted to share a few of my favorite Tudor numbers so you'll know what all this is going to be about. So let's take a look at some of my favorite Tudor numbers. One of the things I like to start with is by asking people, why would you think the number 42 is particularly important in the Tudor history? Now, if you're a baseball fan like I am, 42 is a very important number. But we're going to set that aside just a minute, not do baseball history right now, but stick to Tudor history. Why is 42 so important? People have wondered, did one of the Tudors do something really important at age 42? No. Is it because something really important happened in 1542? No. In fact, 42 was one of the first numbers I realized was so important to Tudor history. And it's because when you look at the whole sweep of the Tudor dynasty, 42% of that famous dynasty was under the rule of 2 crowned regnant queens. Mary I and Elizabeth I were the first 2 crowned regnant queens of England, meaning they inherited the throne. They ruled in their own right, not by virtue of being married to a king, but in fact, they were queen. They were the monarch. They were the rulers, Mary and Elizabeth. And when you look at the significance of those 2 reigns together, 42% of the entire dynasty was under the rule of these 2 women. In fact, the final 50 years of the dynasty was under their rule. I don't want to jump ahead yet. In fact, let me stop the share for a second, just chat. So why is that so important? Well, I think it really matters because that had not happened before. Before Mary and Elizabeth, there were 0 crowned regnant queens. No dynasty had had a crowned regnant queen. It just wasn't happening. And Henry VIII worked so hard to make sure his daughters did not come to the throne. But in fact, they are a big part of the reason that the Tudors were able to accomplish what they did. So Mary and Elizabeth, back to back. Between them, they reimagined the monarchy. They completely reimagined the coronation, which, as you might have guessed, was designed for a man. They passed a law was passed during Mary's reign, that the power and authority of a sovereign female was the same as that of her male predecessors. It is spelled out by law. They also reimagined the idea of the Privy Council and the Privy Chamber and the relationship between those two entities. In fact, it was the women at court who were spending time with the monarch in quiet, private moments. And that really shifted the way business was conducted. And the women around the queen had greater influence than ever before. They reimagined all these things despite the legal and social and church assumptions that women were inferior to men. Now, Mary, when she got married, also reimagined the way a consort would be integrated into the English royal court if that consort is in fact a man. So Mary's marriage treaty is very different than any of her predecessors because it literally limits the authority and the ability of the king consort. Philip did become king of England, but his authority was based on his marriage to Mary and could not supersede hers. He could not call parliament on his own. He could not enact laws on his own. He was limited to what Mary wanted. And that had never happened. The woman had never had that kind of authority in a royal marriage. And certainly that reimagines marriage. Now, it did not change marriage for anyone else in the country at that time, but the whole idea that a woman could be in a marriage and not be 100% subservient to her husband was a new way of thinking. And when Elizabeth, who didn't ever get married, but when she was considering marriage, she specified that she expected her marriage treaty to look just like her sister's, because again, she wanted that limitation as well on the man's powers. In fact, Elizabeth decided to keep all of the powers for herself, and she threw out assumptions that had been long held, that a woman had to be married to have a purpose, that a woman had to be married because she couldn't bear the burdens, oh, so heavy, of government by herself. She threw all that and did very well bearing those burdens. There was an idea that a woman couldn't exist without a husband. Well, Elizabeth, as it turns out, is the only adult monarch. Yes, there were some children, the only adult monarch who was never married in her entire reign. Elizabeth threw out that assumption that a woman had to be married. And guess what? The world did not stop turning. The country didn't collapse. No foreign invaders got in. The reigns of Mary and Elizabeth were sound and successful. And the fact that that was 42% of the Tudor dynasty, I think, is very important. Before the Tudors, no dynasty had had a crowned regnant queen. After the Tudors, every dynasty, the Stuarts, the Hanoverians, and then the Saxe-Coburg-Gothas, who become the Windsors, all have at least one crowned regnant queen. The Tudors changed that. So that 42% changed everything. So I think it's a very important number. Now, let's look at another of my favorite numbers, which you saw for a moment. I gave you a tiny preview. It is the number 1. As in one rose and one narrative that explains exactly why the Tudors deserve to be on the throne. That is, of course, the Tudor rose. Now, I've always loved the Tudor rose. I mean, it's just so beautiful. And it is everywhere. When you go to England, you'll see it on buildings, you'll see it in pubs, you'll see it in restaurants, you'll see it in signs, you'll see it on the money. If you watch the coronation, you saw it in the coronation regalia. That Tudor rose is everywhere. And so I started doing some research and trying to figure out, how did Henry VII do that anyway? Well, who is Henry VII and how did he come to be the Tudor monarch and start the dynasty, and why is the rose such a big part of that? Henry Tudor, Henry VII, is the son of Margaret Beaufort and Edmund Tudor. Now, Margaret Beaufort is a descendant of John of Gaunt. That is a royal line. Edmund Tudor has no English royal blood at all. He actually has some French royal blood, but no English royal blood. So it's through Margaret Beaufort that Henry Tudor inherits some royal blood. But the Beaufort line, initially they were illegitimate, and then years later they were retroactively made legitimate when John of Gaunt married their mother. But it was always a little iffy, and there was a lot of contention over whether the Beauforts were really entitled to the royal line to be considered part of that. So it was a little bit of an iffy claim for Henry Tudor. And then how did he get there? Well, it turns out that while the Yorkists were on the throne, Margaret Beaufort managed to remain popular. She was popular at court, was in favor at court throughout the Wars of the Roses. Of course, she was in favor during the reign of Henry VI because he's her relative. But even when Edward IV defeated Henry VI and took the throne, Margaret Beaufort manages to marry well and remain, not 100% of the time, but a whole lot of the time, she's in favor during the reign of Edward IV. And believe it or not, she participates in the coronation of Richard III, carrying the train of Queen Anne Neville. So Margaret Beaufort is well placed. And during the reign of Richard III, she realizes that things are not looking good for her son, Henry Tudor, who's been in exile now for 14 years. And she gets kind of friendly with Elizabeth Woodville. Elizabeth Woodville is the widow of Edward IV and is the mother of Edward V and his brother Richard, the princes in the Tower who have disappeared. She's also the mother of Elizabeth of York. Now, the two boys are considered dead at this time. Elizabeth of York is considered the Yorkist heir, the heir to the Yorkist claim. So Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth Woodville, who are communicating through a physician, come up with a plan. Henry Tudor will marry Elizabeth of York. The two houses will be joined and they will take the throne. And it's kind of an iffy plan. It requires a lot of things that are unlikely to actually happen, but that was the plan. And Henry Tudor was all in. So eventually he leaves his exile he's been in France and Brittany for 14 years. He brings an army of French mercenaries and some disaffected, discontent Englishmen and some Welsh supporters he gathers along the way. It's sort of a ragtag army. And he marches to meet Richard III, who is one of the best military strategists of his day. He is brilliant in battle, and he has a well-funded, well-armed, well-fed, well-trained army waiting to annihilate Henry Tudor. And everyone thought that's what would happen. And stunningly, Henry Tudor and his army end up defeating and killing Richard III. Richard III makes a kind of strategic error, which is surprising for him. But anyway, Henry Tudor wins and he claims the throne. And then he realizes it's not just claiming the throne, but it's keeping the throne. And to do that, you have to tell a pretty good story. So he has to justify to everybody why he should stay on the throne. He marries Elizabeth of York, but that's still not, maybe enough. So he comes up with this idea of the Tudor rose. You take the white rose of York and the red rose of Lancaster, you bring them together, and now we have the Tudor rose. Everyone can understand it. Everybody gets it. That's what we have now, fait accompli. The problem is, of course, the story itself has a lot of holes in it. Now, the White Rose of York actually holds up fairly well. Edward IV did use the White Rose of York. He used other things as well, but he did use the white rose in some of his emblems, as one of his emblems. So that one holds up okay. So Henry has some pictures of Elizabeth of York painted holding a white rose. Okay. The red rose of Lancaster, really problematic because it there really aren't any Lancastrian kings who've used the red rose. Henry himself, when he was fighting Richard III, used the Welsh dragon. So the whole red rose thing has to be sort of made up. He makes it up and he goes back in some of the old documents and he adds some red roses and he has his portrait painted holding a red rose. And he leans all into this idea that we have the red rose of Lancaster, made up or not, and the white rose of York, and he brings them together. And it was hard, but it was such a brilliant idea. It is a simple symbol. He put it everywhere. Everywhere you look, there's a Tudor rose. In his day, he had songs written about the two roses. When Prince Arthur was born, there was a wonderful poem that was delivered that talked about the red rose and the rose white and coming together to form this beautiful new rose. One rose, two families, one rose. There is no need for any further debate about York versus Lancaster because we're all together. So, in what I consider to be one of the most brilliant branding exercises in history, Henry VII manages to brand his family with the Tudor rose, brand his dynasty in a way that has lasted for hundreds of years until the Tudor rose is often now considered the English rose. And it is everywhere, from money to the coronation regalia to pubs. It is everywhere. And that is the one that is one of my favorite numbers. Now, let's take a look at another of my favorite numbers. It might be one that surprises you a little bit. 70. No, it's not because Elizabeth I lived to be almost 70. It is, in fact, because 70% of someone's life was spent being a loyal husband. And it might surprise you who that is, because we think of Henry VIII as being on a marital merry-go-round. I mean, there's just one wife after another. He has that image. He is, after all, the most married monarch in English history. So it's no wonder we think that. But in fact, 70% of the reign of Henry VIII is spent with two women, Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. Now, I am a big believer that all 6 wives have their own stories, and all of those stories are valuable. All of those voices are valuable. I love the musical 6 that looks at all of them. And there is a new book coming out about the 6 wives that I am so excited for that looks at all of them. But when we think about the impact on Henry VIII himself, I do think it's worth considering that 70% of his reign is spent with Catherine of Aragon and, or because they do overlap a little bit, Anne Boleyn. Those two women have an extraordinary impact on him over the nearly 30 years they are with him. And then in the next 11 years, after Anne Boleyn dies in 1536, very violently at Henry's command, there are 4 wives in 11 years. So there are 2 wives in almost 30 years and then 4 wives in 11 years. So when we think about the impact of those women on him, 70% is a lot of impact. So let's look at that a little bit. Henry knew Catherine even before, long before he married her, because he knew her when she came over 7 years earlier to marry Arthur. So in terms of his life, it's even more than 70%. She came over to marry Arthur. They were married. Henry participated in the wedding. He's the one that walked her down the aisle. And then they went off, Arthur and Catherine, and then he died. It was less than a 6-month marriage. She comes back. Elizabeth of York, Henry VII's wife, tries to have another child after Arthur dies. She does have another child who dies, and sadly, Elizabeth of York dies. So Henry VII has lost his heir and favorite son, let's be honest, and he's lost his wife. And now Catherine of Aragon and young Prince Henry are left with a not very nice Henry VII, who really sort of turns in to the worst version of himself, becoming really grasping and really paranoid and really suspicious of everybody. And both Henry and Catherine chafe a little bit at the restrictions he puts on them. This goes on for 7 years, and I'm sure they were both very relieved when Henry VII died in 1509. And Henry VIII, one of the very first things he did, even before his coronation, was look over and say, "There she is. I'll marry her," and marries Catherine of Aragon. He probably thought of her as some sort of a damsel in distress. I mean, she had been really unhappy in England once Arthur had died, and he marries her and he makes her Queen of England. And it turns out that she's a lot stronger than he imagined. But in any case, at the beginning of his reign, they are extremely happy together. They are very much, they love each other. They're very happy. They're the young king and queen with all this promise. And in 1511, just a couple of years after they're married, Catherine gives birth to a baby boy, Prince Henry. There are celebrations, there are jousts, there's this grand christening. Everything's wonderful. And the baby dies after 7 weeks. And tragically, that is the only baby boy that Catherine has that lives. Now, she does have a daughter in 1516, Princess Mary. But Henry is obsessed with having a son. He does not consider it at all possible that a woman should be on the throne. So he is starting to really think, we've got to make a change here. By 1529, he's been on the throne for 20 years, and in his mind, he has no heir. But something else has happened by 1529, and that is that he's fallen head over heels for Anne Boleyn. We don't know exactly when that happened, but we do know 1526, 27, by 1529, he is all in. So he decides he wants Anne Boleyn. And she, who has watched him take her sister Mary as a mistress and then discard her when he's done, is not at all interested in that. She is holding out for something better. So Henry decides he wants to marry Anne Boleyn. So he wants to have his first marriage annulled because he's just realized, wait a minute, Catherine was married to Arthur, and so I shouldn't have married her. The Pope shouldn't have given us that dispensation. That only occurred to him at that point. So he tries to convince the Pope to annul the marriage. Now, annulling a marriage for political reasons is not that far out of the question for a Pope. Unfortunately for Henry, this Pope has recently been captured by Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who happens to be the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. So an annulment is not going to happen from the Pope. Henry asks, and eventually he breaks up not just with Catherine, but with the Pope, and it sets up himself as the head of the Church of England. So he secretly marries Anne Boleyn. Then he has his Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, say, yep, the marriage to Catherine of Aragon, null and void. The marriage to Anne Boleyn, all go. And Anne is crowned Queen of England in June of 1533. She is already visibly pregnant. So now all we need to do is sit back and wait for the baby boy to be born, because we all know it's going to be a baby boy. And enter Elizabeth. Now, of course, nobody knows what Elizabeth will become. Henry and Anne's marriage is not immediately over, but that exotic feistiness that allowed Anne Boleyn to keep Henry interested for those 7 long years of courtship don't actually satisfy him in a queen. It's one thing in a girlfriend, but as a queen, he really wanted somebody else. And the main thing he wanted was somebody who would give him a son. And Anne Boleyn did not. So by 1536, he is starting to have very much a roving eye. And Anne Boleyn has another very devastating miscarriage or stillbirth, where apparently the child was a male. And then she makes a pretty big mistake and speaks of the king's death. She's not plotting the king's death. She's not hoping for the king's death. In fact, she knows darn well if the king were to die, she is very unpopular. She would be in big trouble. But she kind of makes a joke about the king's death. If aught but good were to come to the king, she says to one of her male courtiers, you would look to have me. That's not the kind of thing you're supposed to joke about. It is overheard. Things unravel pretty quickly. And in May 1536, by the end of the month, Anne Boleyn has been executed and Henry has married Jane Seymour. From 1536 to 1547, over those 11 years, not always by his choice, but over those 11 years, Henry will have 4 additional wives, but for 70%. So if you think about that amount of influence on him and on his reign, it was those 2 women, Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. So 70 is a pretty important number. All right, let's look at another one, and that is the number 13. I don't know if you think it's lucky or not, but I believe there's a very important 13-day period in July of 1553 that really makes a big difference in Tudor history. And it comes down to the question of a question that's not answered with the number 13, but the question is, how many Tudor monarchs were there? 5 or 6. And that comes down to, do you think Jane Grey was a lady or a queen? And I am saying, I believe Jane Grey was a 13-day queen. I believe she had 13-day reign, not 9. And here's why. Let's talk about the 13 first, and then we'll also talk about why I think she's a queen. So why I think she's a queen, it all starts back with our friend Henry VIII when he was deciding, I'm married to Catherine of Aragon. No, years later, I've decided I'm not married to Catherine of Aragon. I'm married to Anne Boleyn. So my daughter with Catherine of Aragon, well, she has to be out of the succession to make room for the son I'm going to have with Anne Boleyn. So Henry VIII was the first monarch to involve Parliament in the succession. He, in fact, passes 2, 3 succession acts. And the second one, in addition, so the first one takes Mary out, puts Elizabeth in. The second succession act, which is after the execution of Anne Boleyn, reminds everybody that's Mary's out and then puts Elizabeth out as well. Well, that means in 1536, Henry has no legitimate heir. So he also, as part of the Second Succession Act, he also says, well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to give myself permission to name anybody I want as the heir. So he does that. So now that's a law. That's in an act passed by Parliament. The Third Succession Act, he's going off to fight in France, and he thinks, well, there's only Edward. And if anything happens to Edward and I'm off fighting the French valiantly and bravely from the back. Anyway, if anything happened to Edward, I better put the girls back in. So he reinstates Mary and Elizabeth in the succession, but he does not make them legitimate. He's wiped out the marriage with both of their mothers. That means they're illegitimate. That means legally they cannot inherit land or title from their father, according to law. So now we have laws on the books that a king can choose a successor and that Mary and Elizabeth are illegitimate and cannot inherit a title. And that's what Edward uses to bypass them in the succession. Henry absolutely makes that possible, even though it's Henry's will, and it is literally in his Third Succession Act and in his will. He goes on and on in his will about what he wants to happen in the succession. And after Edward and all of his descendants, of which there were none, of course, he wanted the throne to go to Mary. Henry makes that really clear. But Edward uses Henry's own laws to bypass both of his half-sisters and name Jane Grey as his heir. Now, he did not live long enough to get that act passed by Parliament. But legally, the basis was there for him taking those steps. So that's why I do think Jane Grey was queen. I know there are a lot of arguments about it. I'm just telling you my view. Now, why do I think it's 13 days? Edward dies on July 6th. And I believe someone then became queen. It had to be a queen. There were 9 people that Edward was considering. I mean, he got rid of Elizabeth and Mary, so that meant 7 people. They were all women. The Tudors were much better at having daughters than sons. And when they did have sons and those sons grew up, sometimes the Tudors saw those adult men as threats and executed them. So there weren't a lot of women choice. There were a lot of women choices, not a lot of men. Edward had 9 women. So he landed upon Jane Grey. She was the granddaughter of Mary Tudor, who's the younger sister of Henry VIII. That all made sense. She was in the succession. In Henry's Succession Act, she comes after Mary and Elizabeth. Edward excludes Mary and Elizabeth. Then Jane makes a good choice. But it happened as soon as Edward died. Now, Edward's death was kept secret, but someone became queen when Edward died. It's just like when Her Majesty the Queen died last September, Charles became king. It happens immediately. Now, Jane Grey was not proclaimed queen for 4 days because John Dudley, the president of the council, had to rush around and put everything in place to make sure they were ready to name Jane as queen. But it didn't depend on the proclamation. King Charles's proclamation was a few days after the queen died and he became king. You become the heir becomes the monarch when the monarch dies. And so I believe Jane became queen on July 6th, and that's what gets us to 13 days. Now, why is it only 13 days? Do I believe she acted like queen? I absolutely. She was immediately, I mean, she was surprised when she became queen. She didn't go after it. She didn't seek it. But once she became queen, she was all in. She was writing letters to her strongest nobles, demanding their support of her reign, signing them Jane the Queen. She was making royal appointments, signing them Jane the Queen. She was in the Tower of London, which is not just a prison, it is also the strongest castle. She had the treasury, she had the army, she had the Privy Council. Foreign governments, including that of Charles V, Mary's relative and strongest supporter, were willing to recognize Jane as queen. And in fact, when Charles had his ambassadors reach out, they did not demand that Mary be queen. All they asked, as they were saying, they would recognize Jane as queen, but they insisted that Mary be safe. They did not want her to be seen as a threat and imprisoned or threatened. All they asked was that Mary be safe. So they were willing to recognize Jane as queen. What all these people, Dudley and the council and Charles V and the ambassadors, what all these men did, they underestimated Jane. Actually, I don't think John Dudley ever expected Jane to be as fierce as she was. John Dudley had married Jane to his son, Guilford, and he expected Guilford to be made the king. And Jane said, no, I'll make him a duke, but I'm not making him the king. I'm the queen and I'm doing this myself. Really interesting. Everybody underestimated Mary. They thought she would be quiet and go away. And she absolutely did not. She gathered supporters. She gathered more and more supporters. People, Catholics and Protestants, were flocking to her side. She was able to ride into London and take the throne without any violence or any fight at all, because Jane's supporters realized that Mary was in fact going to win, and they just went. It's like Nicola Tallis said, the tide turned and the council turned with it. They all just turned to Jane. So she had a very short, they all just turned to Mary from Jane. So Jane had a short reign, but I believe she was queen and she reigned for 13 days. It was short, but I think significant. All right. So what's my next important one of my favorite numbers? I'll tell you, that is the number 19. Another day thing. This time it's 19 days. I want to start by talking about the famous royal road trips. The Tudors love to go on progress. Now, one of the reasons the Tudor court was always on the move was purely logistical. Just imagine the mess. All right. Imagine about 1,000 people at court and very cramped quarters and eating going on and sleeping. And then there's the idea that there is no running water. Most people bathe once a year, and there are no toilets except for, there are some holes along a wall, maybe inside or outside. It was a mess. And so, of course, the Tudor court would move from palace to palace around London always. But during the summer, especially for Henry VII and Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, the court went on progress. The king and then the queen went on progress. Now, Henry VII and Henry VIII used their progresses really interesting ways. They would go to areas where there had been rebellions, or maybe there was a threat of rebellion. They would go with a full force, with soldiers, with lots of servants, jewels, gowns, and they would sort of wow the people into submission to either say they were so sorry and pledge their support after a rebellion, or to maybe avoid a rebellion that seemed to be bubbling. So they went to areas where there were troubles many times. Elizabeth did things a little differently. She didn't travel as far as her father or grandfather had done. She stayed quite a bit closer to London, and she preferred to go to areas where she was already popular and she could count on a good time. Another thing Elizabeth liked to do, because these progresses were so expensive, she stayed not in royal properties, but she really liked to stay with her subjects. And that defrayed most of her costs right over to them. I mean, what could be better? What could be a greater honor than hosting your queen? So she just always assumed everybody was lining up in the hopes that she would visit them. That was not always the case. In fact, there are people like Sir Henry Lee who had hosted the Queen once, and she was thinking of visiting him again on another progress. And he wrote to William Cecil begging that the Queen not come because he had not recovered financially from her previous visit. Housing and feeding and entertaining the whole court, because the court came to you, was incredibly expensive. But if it was something that you could afford and were willing to do, it could be quite an opportunity. And no one took a better opportunity than in the 1575 progress, where the Queen spent 19 days with Robert Dudley at Kenilworth. 19 days is the longest she ever spent with one single subject. So already it stands out. This was in 1575. Dudley had been trying to get the Queen to marry him for a very long time, pretty much ever since his first wife died of mysterious circumstances. Anyway, we won't go into that right now. But in any case, Dudley was really trying to get the Queen to marry him. And so this was sort of his last big attempt. He welcomed her to Kenilworth. He had expanded the home. He had built a lake. He did all these things to make this space magnificent for her. He hired some of the greatest poets in the country to create pageants and masks and entertainments for her. He hired dancers. He hired acrobats. He arranged for fireworks and a water pageant. He also commissioned 2 sets of portraits of himself and the Queen, matching portraits like a married couple would have. He commissioned 2 of them and hung them in prominent places at Kenilworth. So over that 19-day visit, his goal was that she would get the message in all kinds of ways that that was where she belonged. Now, the problem became that Dudley was so concerned about promoting himself. Many of the masks had a debate between virginity and married life. And guess what? They all came down on married life being preferable. Some of the debates or some of the masks also looked at the need for war and warriors. And it was almost like Dudley was hedging his bets just in case she wasn't captivated by the portraits of them on the wall or the debating pageants coming down in favor of marriage. If she wasn't willing to marry him and make him the king, his other idea was he would seek glory in battle. And so he wanted her to give him some kind of great office so that he could go off and succeed in battle and become great and known for greatness in that way. In any case, with the court being at his home, he was able to automatically rise in status. I mean, he was always jockeying for position at court when it was in London, But now it's his turf, and he was taking full advantage and really promoting himself. In fact, there was one mask where the storyline was there was a woman pretty clearly representing Elizabeth who became endangered, and there was a man pretty clearly representing Dudley who had to rescue her. This was not the kind of message Elizabeth really approved of, that she needed to be rescued by a man. In fact, she spent a whole lot of time and a whole lot of energy pushing back against that assumption. Some of the pageants were explained to her, and there were some she censored and would not allow to be performed. And as the time went on and it was more and more about Dudley, she decided she would leave, and she, in fact, left. 19 days, it was supposed to be longer. So even though it was the longest time she ever spent at one courtier's or one subject's home, she left before they thought she would. She left early. And so Dudley rushed to have one of the poets create a goodbye poem, and it ended with this poet following after the queen and calling and sort of shouting after her, "Live here, good queen, live here." Well, Elizabeth did not decide to live there. She went back to London and lived there. Dudley himself sort of decided that was his last big chance. He did do a little bit of fighting for the queen, but the other thing he did was he secretly married Lettice Knowles because he wanted to start his own family and have his own legacy. And it pretty much looked like he was never going to become king. So he decided to take matters into his own hands. Elizabeth found out there was a huge fallout. We won't go into that. That's a story for another time. But lest you think that this Kenilworth pageant really didn't have a whole lot of meaning, I want to tell you about a couple of parts of the pageant that are pretty interesting. There's one where Cupid, in one of the pageants at Kenilworth, Cupid is aiming his arrow at the Virgin, and he shoots his arrow and it doesn't get to the intended target, but it lands in a flower and, in fact, turns that flower into a love potion. That might be reminiscent of a storyline you've heard. Let me tell you a little more. There's also a water pageant that happened at Kenilworth where a mermaid rode upon a dolphin's back, singing a sweet song. Now, both of those items, Cupid's arrow falling on a flower and turning it into a love potion, and a mermaid riding upon a dolphin's back, both of those end up in Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. Pretty close to what's described in the Kenilworth pageant. And who's to say, in 1575, John Shakespeare was mayor of Stratford, which is pretty nearby. He may have very well have come to the pageant, which was open to local leaders, and they were encouraged to come. And he might have brought his young son, William, with him. We don't know that, of course, but it is very interesting that over that 19 days, a couple of those images found their way into a play that has become one of Shakespeare's most popular. So these are just some of my favorite Tudor numbers. I've given you just a little glimpse of why I, not a math person, but why I was so eager to run the numbers and why I want to share with you the Tudors by numbers. It's a new way of looking at this dynasty we think we know so well and discovering even more about them. So thank you so much for spending this time with me, for spending this season again with me. Thank you for listening. Thank you in advance for buying and pre-ordering my book. I wish you the best of summers, and I really hope you'll be joining us for summer specials, which will be so much fun. We've got some fiction stuff coming. It's going to be a great summer. And then as we kick off season 4 in September, which, believe it or not, will be here before we know it. Thank you, as always, for joining me. And let's keep shaking up history together.